Earlier this week, we talked about how Ben Shapiro's conservative audience responded very negatively to his video about the evil left celebrating the death of a health insurance company CEO. But now I actually want to look at the reaction to a liberal podcast, in particular, Pod Save America. Now, while the response to them from their audience wasn't as overwhelmingly negative compared to Ben Shapiro's audience, I will say that their audience was still pretty blunt at telling them that they were very out of touch with regular people. So we're going to talk about that reaction, and I also want to address some of the points that they make in that video because what they say is actually pretty insidious, and I'm going to tell you why. But first, let's look at that like to dislike ratio. As you can see, they are currently getting ratioed by their audience with more dislikes than likes, and the commenters are explaining why their takes were so tone deaf. The trouble with the murder is bad denying healthcare claims is also a bad take is that it's just factually wrong. In 2024 America, you are punished for committing murder, and you are handsomely rewarded for denying healthcare claims. People who have suffered so that others can be made rich by their suffering aren't going to be against punishment for what you call bad, but the legal system and business community calls good performance. Exactly. Don't expect the deer to weep when they are told a hunter has died. I think you're massively underestimating the rage Americans feel over not just healthcare in America, but wealth disparity and the feeling that we are totally powerless to change anything. Even if this murder does somehow bring us Medicare For All, which nobody's expecting, by the way, it'll come too late for thousands upon thousands of loved ones who didn't have to die, but did directly because of our inhumane, ugly, intentionally cruel system. I have no empathy left for the CEOs who make millions off of the suffering of people like me. Nobody in the health insurance system had an iota of empathy when it was my twin sister who couldn't afford insulin and died at 26. Wow. So my empathy is reserved for the hundreds of thousands of grieving Americans like me. It didn't have to be this way, but the 1% are the ones who pushed it all this far. This person says, as a breast cancer survivor, I know firsthand how terrible the insurance companies are. I was denied. I had never missed a payment. They fought me for 5 weeks until my daughter started to contact news agencies. Finally, my plight was taken up by a local television station. Once my story was aired, the next morning I got a registered letter stating that my insurers had decided to cover my treatment. All well and good, right? While going through chemotherapy, I was only able to work part-time due to my reaction to the drugs I was receiving. That insurance company raised my premium every quarter. It got so expensive that I had to move in with my son. My story is just one of millions. Americans are screwed if they need healthcare. The richest country in the world has a criminally corrupt insurance system. This is so tone deaf and frustrating. It isn't just about healthcare. If you guys will pay attention, it's that people, working class people, are tired of being screwed over by private industry, by government, by the wealthy. This is a class issue. And last but not least, I am so sick of the "this guy had kids" line. So did all the people he knowingly let die by denying their claims. Those people had kids too. Yeah, so based on this small sample of comments, it's evident that these privileged rich dudes just don't get it. But I actually think that they know more than they're letting on. A Gallup poll was released this week that found that 62% of Americans believe that it is the federal government's responsibility to ensure all Americans have health care. And that sentiment is even more widespread among the Democratic Party's base. Now, I promise you that these nerds are very much aware of the fact that this is indeed the case. They know that the Democratic Party's base supports single payer. But they have covertly tried to undermine public support for Medicare For All in order to get people to think that it's more realistic and practical to keep the for-profit model in place. Let me show you what I mean, though. As journalist Lindsay explains, in 2018, when Medicare For All was gaining momentum, pro-insurance industry advocates founded a nonprofit called United States of Care to explicitly fight against Medicare For All and propagandize for pro-business friendly ACA policies. Guess who's on the Founders Council of that M4A PSYOP? And as you can see, she shares a screenshot showing that Jon Favreau of Pod Save America is on the Founders Council. Now, if you look at the policies that they push, it's all in line with the talking points that we've heard from Democratic Party politicians about expanding access to healthcare and lowering the cost of prescription drugs by expanding eligibility for Medicare and Medicaid. And all of these policy recommendations are good, by the way, but notice that they conveniently allow the current for-profit model to stay intact. They don't even mention a public option, by the way. But back to Lindsay, because she's going to explain that we don't hear much about this group anymore since they accomplished their goal, which was to suppress support for Medicare For All among the Democratic Party's base. Now, she also points to an episode of Chapo Trap House where they break down the moneyed interests behind this consultant grift, and we don't have time to get into that now, but I'm going to link to that episode down below if you want to listen to it. But Just know that these people are deliberately trying to get their liberal audience to believe that they should accept less than every other comparable OECD nation that already guarantees healthcare to all of their citizens. Now, I don't know why they're doing it. I have no idea what's in their hearts. Maybe they genuinely believe in our for-profit healthcare system. Maybe they're trying to alleviate the pressure Democrats feel from the base, because we all know that the base wants Medicare for all, but politicians don't want to do that because their health industry donors wouldn't be too happy about the politicians that they've bankrolled supporting a policy that would existentially threaten them. Either way, it doesn't matter what their intent is. Just know that the Pod Save Bros are bad faith actors subtly pushing a corporate-friendly agenda to the detriment of their own fucking audience, which is really disgusting. But thankfully, their viewers saw through their bullshit. Now, with that being said, I do want to dig into some clips here so you can see why their audience was so angry about their commentary. So first, let's start with Jon Favreau. He said this about the 2020 Democratic Party primary, which is very interesting now that we have some additional context about his backstory.
Fast forward to the 2020 Democratic primary, where the central debate in the primary was over Medicare for All. And what happened there, Medicare for All ended up less popular than it started at the beginning of the primary, because when you ask people, should the government guarantee health insurance, people say yes, like 60% say yes. When you ask people, do you think it should be a government-run system or a private insurance system, more people want private insurance than they do government. That number has narrowed now, but that's still. So it is a problem with the insurance industry. It is a problem with their lobbying. It is a problem with the money in politics. It is certainly a problem with the Republican Party, but it's also, we have work to do convincing people to change this system.
I wonder why Medicare for All was less popular by the end of the Democratic Party primary. It's almost like some pro-insurance nonprofit popped up in order to drive down support for Medicare for All at the behest of for-profit insurance companies. Interesting. I wonder why that happened. Insufferable. Now, what he's doing, it feels like gaslighting, because he's saying that in order to get a big policy like Medicare for All, we first got to convince people to change the system, which is ironic because his nonprofit tried to convince people to not change the system. But here's the thing. You don't have to convince Americans of shit because they already clearly want to change the system. Look at your comment section, for fuck's sake. Look at the dislikes on that video. I mean, this isn't a left-right issue. Even Ben Shapiro got backlash from his audience. This is an American issue. But he goes on to cite data about the public and how they prefer private healthcare to a government-run system, despite thinking that the government should guarantee healthcare as well. So it's a bit of a contradiction. Now, the way that Americans respond to questions about healthcare reform varies greatly depending on the question and how it's phrased. So if you ask Americans whether or not they like their own healthcare, that's not necessarily an endorsement of their private insurance. If they say yes, it's them acknowledging that they are thankful that they have healthcare in general, because not a lot of people have health insurance in this country that's actually great. And a lot of us didn't have health insurance at some point. So, I mean, if I were asked whether or not I like my private health insurance plan where I pay more than $900 a month, I'd probably say yes, just because I think that that's preferable to having no insurance at all. But if you follow up by asking if I would support getting rid of that plan for a cheaper, more comprehensive single-payer plan where healthcare is free at the point of service, I would say, yeah, I support that. Now, if you follow up again and ask me if I would give my left nut to get that system, I'd say, you bet your ass I would. So if you don't ask Americans questions in a way that gets them to think about this in comprehensive terms, in the ramifications of like what this means for their wallet, you're going to get whatever response you want. Right? But to be fair, our healthcare system is complicated in ways that are beyond comprehension. And because of this, it's easy for corrupt politicians and insurance propagandists to drive down support by obfuscating and by scaring people about wait times and rationing. That's why it's important for platforms like Pod Save America to harness that rage and explain to their audience why a single-payer system is the solution we've all been waiting for. It's important for them to explain how we already have rationing in our current healthcare system. We just ration based on whether or not you can afford healthcare. Medicare for All would save American families thousands of dollars per year. And more importantly, it would save 68,000 lives per year. But these guys aren't talking about that. In fact, they're actually taking issue with the people who are using this moment to push for Medicare for all. And as you're about to see, they're going to do what they usually do. They're going to try to convince their audience that they should accept less.
Part of what happens when you end up only debating, when the debate becomes about are you for single payer or against single payer, is you don't have other debates. A debate like, should we lower the Medicare eligibility age to 60? How about that?
Or I was going to say, to your point about people liking Medicare so much, I think that the plan offered in 2020 that was both the best plan but also the most politically palatable plan and that most people liked it was, remember Pete Buttigieg proposed Medicare for all who want it?
Yes.
And so basically it would allow anyone, if you really want Medicare and you want to be covered by Medicare, you can choose that. And if you really don't want that and you really want your private health insurance plan, you can choose that. And the idea would be that Medicare would be so popular that more and more people would buy in, and we would eventually transition to a system where Medicare covers everyone.
There's a lot of, yes, that was a sort of a form of a public option. But like, you lower the Medicare, like, you know, the public option was killed from Obamacare, and it was killed by a bunch of senators. They all hid behind Joe Lieberman. It was killed by a bunch of people. But one thing that Joe Lieberman personally killed was the Medicare buy-in for people. And that was just a policy to help. Like, if you were between the ages of 60 and 65, that is where your health, you're not yet in Medicare, but you still are in the age where you're starting to have more and more health problems. It's an extremely expensive group to insure. If you get laid off when you're 58, it's incredibly expensive. Like, there's a huge bunch of problems that happen there. And Joe Lieberman personally killed a Medicare buy-in. But like, if we could get the Medicare age down to 60, it costs about $25 billion a year, a tiny, tiny fraction of the budget. And that alone would bring healthcare costs down for fucking everybody just by dint of getting this pool of expensive people to insure off. But like, these are the kinds of things I think we should be talking about, like simple fixes that get us on the road to Medicare for all.
You see what they're doing, right? They're trying to co-opt the conversation that we're all having about healthcare, and they're trying to set up parameters so that way we ask for less, right? They're trying to talk about policies that will put us on a path towards Medicare for all or put us down the road to Medicare for all because they want to placate us. But understand that they're trying to negotiate you down from the position of Medicare for all. They know that's the policy that we really want, but if they can ease the pressure just a little bit by making a few more tweaks around the edges to the system, they're hoping that the fervor for a more transformative policy like Medicare for all will die down. And to be clear, they're not proposing these incremental changes because they actually want to put us on a path towards Medicare for all. If you want Medicare for all, you can just support Medicare for all directly. But the reason why they're dangling everything but Medicare for all in front of you is because they're hoping that you'll take the bait. Since all of these solutions that they're proposing conveniently would let private insurance companies continue to exist. Isn't that interesting? See what they're doing? See, in Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan and Pramila Jayapal's plan as well, they offered comprehensive coverage that bans duplicative care. So in other words, private insurance companies wouldn't be allowed to cover what the government already covers in that system, because that prevents it from devolving into a two-tiered system where rich people can jump the line and pay for better care than poor people are able to get. Banning duplicative care in a single-payer system means that we all have the same exact quality of healthcare, regardless if you're a politician, a billionaire, or you're Joe who works at McDonald's. So I say all this to say, Bernie's Medicare for All proposal would have killed private insurance companies. They could technically still exist, sure, but there wouldn't be much for them to cover. It's why healthcare stocks tanked in 2019 during the Democratic Party primary after Bernie Sanders introduced this plan, as the CBS News headline points out. Now, look, I'll be completely honest. I would be happy to have a public option instead of the Affordable Care Act, just as I'm happy to have the Affordable Care Act instead of the previous system where insurance companies could literally deny coverage to people based on pre-existing conditions. But they're pushing a public option because it's a multi-payer system, which means that private insurance companies can still exist. Now, on paper, it makes sense to have a public option because it forced private insurance companies to compete with the public plan that's offered by the government, which is going to be cheaper and better. But the problem is that when you have a public option that coexists alongside private plans, what's going to ultimately happen is private insurance companies are going to offer plans to young and healthy people so they can then dump sick people onto the public plan, since sick people obviously are more expensive to cover, which means that eventually that public option is going to become overburdened and inevitably underfunded with time. And once that happens, Republicans and health insurance companies are going to point to that as evidence that government-run healthcare just doesn't work. It's a catch-22. The way that you keep costs down is to have every American on the same plan in the same risk pool. The Pod Save Bros are well aware of this fact. They know this. But remember, the goal isn't to actually sell you on the public option. They're just trying to talk you down right now from supporting Medicare for All. But once you agree that the public option would suffice, then they'll talk you down from that to get you to accept even more incremental changes like the ones proposed by John's nonprofit, which doesn't propose a public option, by the way. It is incredibly disingenuous. But listen to the way that they talk up the public option as if it was even on the table when we all know it wasn't on the table. Nonetheless, here's what they said.
If we had won the Senate this time around and won the House and won the presidency, then we'd be talking about a public option for a second term.
And these should be part of the, like, when we talk about, like, what are Democrats for? We spent a long, what is our big agenda for the future? Like, these kinds of big changes have to be part of it.
Hey, asshole, a public option isn't the big change the base wants. And I don't know why you're pretending like Kamala would have delivered us a public option. She did not support a public option. She supported an expansion to Medicare to cover long-term care. Now, again, I support that. That would be great. But it certainly falls short of a public option, wouldn't you say? Furthermore, even if Kamala Harris did support a public option, I'm sorry, I just don't trust that she would have actually fulfilled that promise. You know who ran on a public option? Barack Obama. You want to know who else ran on a public option? Biden. But once he got elected, we never heard about it again. So don't lie to your viewers and pretend like it was ever on the table in the first place when it wasn't. And even if it were on the table, John's nonprofit would have driven down support for it at the behest of insurance industry funders that support that nonprofit. But I think that this tells me that we just need to improve our negotiating position when I hear them say shit like this, right? We say we want Medicare for all, and these guys counter with a public option as an offer. So you know what? Our starting position should now be a national healthcare system like the UK, where hospitals are nationalized and doctors and nurses are public employees. How about we start there? That's what we should do, because from there, they'd then have to counter offer Medicare for all. So it'd take them longer to talk us down to the shittier position that they're trying to force on us. So, if we start off in a stronger negotiating position, I think that might help us in the future. But I want to get to their commentary on Luigi Mangione, because unlike Ben Shapiro, they were aware of the real anger that Americans were feeling, and they were taking notice of the lack of empathy for the CEO. The problem is that even though they know it exists, they're clearly irritated by that anger and even called it performative.
The kind of like performative, the way you demonstrate you really understand what's broken in our healthcare system is by performing this lack of empathy. That's how you demonstrate you really get it. And if you don't have that lack of empathy, that means you don't really get it. All of that, I was just sort of waiting for, and of course, like unfolded actually worse than I expected. It was all pretty ugly. The thing that I like, there was a lot of like earned vitriol, like insurance companies. Some are better than others. Plenty play games, even break the law to try to avoid paying. We have a cruel and broken system. Like, that's what we have. Like, this guy, well compensated, is a tool of a broken system. This insurance company exists and benefits from a broken system. And, like, that to me, like, I want to have a debate about the broken healthcare system and why we have this ridiculous system where half the people get insurance through work, which creates these incredibly convoluted and broken incentives, where we have publicly traded companies that exist to create a difference between how much they pay out in health benefits versus how much they recoup in premiums. Like, their job is to maximize that differential. We built a whole system around it. That's fucking stupid. That is terrible. That causes all kinds of harms. But like, the idea that we're going to associate the murder of a health executive with Medicare for All, to me, does not bring us anywhere closer to Medicare for All. We're not going to shoot our way to universal health care. And it ends up becoming a kind of vicious and negative and divisive debate, a debate we can win without kind of needing to resort to this sort of like ridiculous kind of performative, I don't know what you'd call it, theatrics, heroics, I don't know.
So on one hand, I will give him credit where it's due. He's explaining specifically why the system is bad. It stems from the profit motive, which conflicts with the obligation to provide people with health care. So it's important that he says that. But what's interesting to me is that he'll acknowledge that the system is broken, but then try to keep that system in place with milquetoast solutions nonetheless. And I think that that is actually the ideological difference here. He thinks the system is broken, which means you can fix the system, whereas everybody else in the comment section is saying, actually, the system isn't necessarily broken. It's working as intended. So that's where there's this disconnect between him and his audience. But when he talked, you could just hear the contempt ooze from him towards the people who were vocalizing their lack of empathy. Like he was irritated by them almost as if they were a nuisance, because now he has to try to talk about why Medicare for All isn't the best solution, even though everybody wants it. But listen, nobody thinks that assassinating the CEO is going to get us Medicare for All. Nobody thinks that. This is a systemic issue that requires a systemic solution. But the reason why people gauge whether or not somebody gets it based on their level of empathy is because it tells us a lot about your rich privilege or luck. Right? People have no empathy for the CEO because he had no empathy for them. His company has inflicted pain and irreversible trauma on countless Americans. And this pain and suffering has been inflicted on Americans during the worst times of their lives. Companies like UnitedHealthcare made things worse for these families and never cared at all. You know, people have gone bankrupt and died because of this company. So yeah, I think that a lack of empathy is a pretty good indicator as to whether or not somebody gets it. So if you find out, for example, that a serial killer was killed, are you going to feel sad? Of course not. You're going to view it as justice being served for all of his victims. Now, you might not want to kill the serial killer yourself, but you're not going to shed a tear for them or cry. But I actually think that's probably not a good comparison, because odds are the CEO killed far more than any serial killer, even the most notorious ones throughout our history. But the Pod Save Bros, you know, they're trying to have it both ways. They're feigning sympathy and trying to understand people's reactions here, but they're fundamentally misunderstanding and misrepresenting them at the same time, which kind of proves that the sympathy that they're showing towards their audience is phony.
I'm going to take the I'll take the neolib squishy centrist position that murder.
That's it. Let's hear it.
Murder is bad.
Yeah.
Also denying people life-saving health care because they can't afford it, bad. How about that?
Wow, that's incredible.
How about that? Isn't that crazy?
Incredible.
Just out there.
Incredible.
Hope all the murderers are caught and punished. Also hope we pass more laws to make sure that everyone can get the health care they need without the insurance company putting them through hell, which insurance companies frequently do.
Yeah, I feel like the other question, like, why do we have a system where all these people have horror stories, like terrible stories about what it's like to engage with these companies? These companies exist to deny claims and make life harder. And, you know, Barack Obama used to tell stories about what it was like when his mother had cancer and how you're dealing with the worst moment of your life and you're on the phone with insurance companies. Like, why does this system exist? And, you know, the debate online, fine, it's not real life. But I do think it captures something that is real about the healthcare debate, which is there are all these people that are screaming like the system is fucking stupid. It is stupid, right? Yeah. And yet when you try to change it, you run into this buzzsaw. Now, part of that is because the insurance lobby donates a lot to campaigns. They run a lot of ads. There's a lot of anti-government, anti-Medicare propaganda. There's a lot of right-wing propaganda about this. But the reality is when you ask people, do you like your insurance? The vast majority say they do. Even when a majority of those people say they've had problems with their health insurance, that 1 in 6 say that they've had claims that they could never resolve.
Yeah.
They could never resolve.
Now, they go on to cite some more polls to prove, I guess, that Americans actually love their health insurance. Now, they're framing this as, you know, Americans like their insurance. We don't agree, but that's kind of just the way that it is. But they're saying this in a climate where everybody is screaming about how bad our climate is in this country for health insurance. So it feels kind of tone deaf for you to say that. But I mean, they clearly want to have it both ways. On one hand, they want to pat us on the heads and tell us that our anger is justified. But on the other hand, they want to reinforce this idea that people aren't actually angry and they love their health insurance. And just a couple of quick fixes are going to make things better. See, the polls say they like it, so they like it. It implies that, you know, the angry people are actually the ones that are out of touch, not them. It's duplicitous as hell. And they can cite polls to prove their point, but guess what? I can do the same thing. I can cite polls to prove my point. Boom. 70% support for Medicare for All. This was the second poll, by the way, with that result around the same time. Now, yes, these polls were conducted in 2018, so they are outdated, and public support has since fallen, in part thanks to the efforts of John's nonprofit. But they're insinuating that we shouldn't make sweeping changes to the system because Americans wouldn't want that. Now, Public opinion is important, don't get me wrong, but what ultimately matters is that we implement solutions that work, regardless of how popular they are. Gay marriage wasn't very popular at one point. Does that mean that we shouldn't have gotten it, or that we should have waited to implement gay marriage until everybody was like, okay, sure, they can have civil rights now? No, because the job of lawmakers is to find solutions to societal problems. And the solution for healthcare has been staring us in the face for decades. And I promise you, if Americans had Medicare for All, they would never want to go back to the for-profit model. But they're cherry-picking these polls to justify the existence of our current for-profit model that they're fighting to keep but tweak. But how about this? No deal. No deal. I don't support that. Read our lips. We want Medicare for all and nothing less. Healthcare should be free at the point of service to every single person in this country. If you don't agree with that, you have to admit that you're okay with people dying if they can't afford health insurance. Even a public option is going to require people to pay money each month to get healthcare. If they can't afford that, they don't get healthcare. Now, maybe these guys are okay with that, since they're probably multimillionaires who'd be able to pay out of pocket if their claims were denied. But working people, they don't deserve an early death or bankruptcy because they happen to get sick. Now, that's not what they're saying, to be clear, but the system that they are arguing to keep in place is going to facilitate that result. And if they were really sympathetic to their audience and the anger that they're feeling towards the system, they would stop fucking shilling for it. But that's what they're doing, and that's how you know they're full of shit.
When you acting like a baby.